Isabella in Measure for Measure, saintly angel or crazy psycho, inevitable female product of her time or messed up by repressed, guilt-ridden angst, well-deserving wife of the most powerful man in Vienna at the end of the play, or eternally crushed by hypocritical, perverted patriarchy. Let's probe. This is Schofield on Shakespeare.
Isabella's first appearance in the play is in Act 1, Scene 4, which is set at a nunnery. Isabella has decided to become a nun and is shown questioning Francisca about the rules and regulations of the establishment and vocation. Indeed, in great swaths of the play, Isabella comes across as a committed Christian. In this scene, she refuses to respond to any of pervy Lucio's sexualised banter and behaves with nun-like restraint and dignity at all times. In particular, this is seen when Lucio first tells her that Claudio is in prison because of illegal extramarital sex, which, according to him, should be praised. Her response to this movement towards gleeful smut is admirably concise and dismissive. "Sir, make me not your story." In other words, don't involve me with your immature tales and jokes. Act 2, Scene 2 sees Isabella with the newly put in temporary charge of Vienna superficially puritanical Angelo. She is in a difficult position. As a wannabe nun, she will imminently take an oath of everlasting chastity as a solemn pledge to God. Yet, to save her brother, she has to somehow convince this apparently equally austere man that Claudio's extramarital sex with Juliet should not be punished too harshly. Her awkward position, her dilemma, is shown when she nervously beats around the bush during her early exchanges with an impatient Angelo. She says, "There is a vice that most I do abhor, and most desire should meet the blow of justice, for which I would not plead, but that I must, for which I must not plead, but that I am at war twixt will and will not." Isabella's natural aversion to naughty sexual shenanigans is shown in her use of the metaphor blow. She firmly believes that those who indulge in such sinful sex should be given a figurative hard hit via Vienna's legal system. However, the fact she has come determined to plead for mercy irrespective of her own qualms, irrespective of the fact she is internally at war with herself about what she should do, highlights her love for Claudio and her Christian willingness to put others ahead of her own awkward situation. Perhaps Isabella's Christian goodness is seen best of all within Act 5, Scene 1 of the play. At this point, she believes that Angelos' corrupt, hypocritical government has resulted in her brother's death, yet she responds to Mariana's pleas and kneels down to try to convince the Duke to save his life. Her words show admirable Christianity, willingness to forgive, and a capacity to forego revenge. She beseeches, "Let him not die. My brother had but justice in that he did the thing for which he died." For Angelo, his act did not o'ertake his bad intent, and must be buried but as an intent that perished by the way. Thoughts are no subjects, intents but merely thoughts. Her argument here is that Angelo thought he was indulging in sinful sex, but actually he was paving the way towards resurrecting a past potentially loving relationship with Mariana, a good thing with capital letters. Whereas Claudio knew inside his heart of hearts that he and Juliet should be waiting to consummate, Angelo only had a lustful intention which didn't come to pass as he initially thought. Isabella even uses legal terminology in her Christian quest to plead for mercy for someone who tried to blackmail her into sex, stating that thoughts are not applicable evidence in a law court, are not subjects.
This is a remarkably selfless speech and presents Isabella as a woman who is able to put aside personal considerations and emotions in a relatively calm, controlled manner in order to adhere to Christian expectations of forgiveness and self-sacrifice.
But, there are other moments in the play which may force the audience or reader to move away from an overly simplistic interpretation of Isabella as a genuine, to paraphrase the name of her middle-of-the-play nemesis, Angela. Even when we first meet her, there are indications that she may be unhealthily repressed, rather than someone who is ideally suited for the life of a nun, if such a thing is possible. Take her opening question to Francisca in Act 1, Scene 4, shown now on screen. She justifies this question by stating that she doesn't desire more freedom or privileges, but bizarrely the opposite. She wishes a more strict restraint upon the sisters stood. On the one hand, this might be the natural nervousness of someone wishing, quite understandably, to know exactly what she is letting herself in for before signing up to be a nun. To save face, rather than admit to this, she claims the opposite to what she is feeling, which is that actually all this seclusion and lack of freedom is daunting. But on the other hand, could Isabella, seemingly like the rest of Vienna, be aware of unhealthy urges nestling uncomfortably close to the surface of her bosom, and so has decided to take radical action to eliminate temptation? The idea of Isabella being a more complex creation than that suggested by Anne Jameson in her 1832 book Characteristics of Women, which essentially sees her as a Christ-like saint, resurfaces during her furious response to Angelos' blackmailing for sex proposal. It is Act 2, Scene 4, and Angelo has found himself increasingly turned on by Isabella's saintly pleas for him to spare her brother's life. So turned on that he has just proposed a deal in which the treasures of Isabella's body are exchanged to save Claudio from the manacles of the law. She rebuts the offer with extraordinary venom. That is, were I under the terms of death, the impression of keen whips I'd wear as rubies, and strip myself to death as to a bed that longing have been sick for, ere I'd yield my body up to shame. These words seem to imply a strange religious longing for suffering and pain. She independently conjures up imagery of sharp whips, whose strokes and cuts she would be proud to flaunt for Christ's sake, just as other lesser women might show off glittering rubies and other jewellery. Further apparent desire for violent pain is shown in her surely paradoxical claim that she would strip naked to show these bleeding whip-induced wounds before her death, rather than give in to Angelo's pestering, which logically would also require stripping naked. Conscious or not, the fervent use of words such as whips, strip, bed and body suggests that Isabella's sexuality may be more complex than she herself realises. Or perhaps she feels her own sexual desires will be satisfied through the all-encompassing gratification of religious experience. Irrespective of interpretation or intent, and the 2004 Globe production clearly presents Isabella as deeply earnest and straight-laced in her rebuttal, these words are still likely to have one most unwanted effect on Angelo, to turn him on further. Here's Sophie Thompson as Isabella and Liam Brennan as Angelo in that 2004 Globe production.
That either you must lay down the treasures of your body to this supposed, or else to let him suffer. What would you do?
As much for my poor brother as myself. That is why I, under the terms of death, the impression of keen whips I'd wear as rubies, and strip myself to death as to a bed that longing have been sick for ere I'd yield my body up to shame.
Then must your brother die?
So perhaps Isabella's language very occasionally hints at repressed desires which subtly undermine her dutiful religious persona, and therefore could be argued to make the ending and her presumed marriage to the Duke slightly more palatable. I'll come back to this ending later in the video. But for the moment, I'd like to look at her treatment of her brother once he has had the temerity to clutch desperately at a stringle straw of hope left to him by Angelos' indecent proposal. This treatment once again cracks the facade of perfect Christianity to which she aspires and portrays her as a terrifyingly fatalistic, even cruel sister.
It is Act 3, Scene 1, and we are inside the prison. Claudio and Isabella are in earnest conversation following the latter's visit to see Angelo. They believe they are alone, although that annoying snoop, the Duke, is closeted nearby, eagerly listening to their every word. After first dismissing Angelo's proposition as outrageous, "Thou shalt not do it," Claudio shares his fears of the unknown of death with his sister in the most graphic terms. He speculates about what it is like for the body to rot and for the spirit to bathe in fiery floods, or to reside in thrilling region of thick-ribbed ice, to be imprisoned in the viewless winds and blown with restless violence round about the pendant world. He is clearly picturing eternal damnation in hell, whether that is being permanently burnt alive, frozen, or violently buffeted for eternity. There is no doubt the man is absolutely terrified about his imminent death. In the 1979 BBC adaptation of the film, Claudio's terror is shown as he clutches desperately onto a wooden post, eyes distracted and tone increasingly fearful.
To lie in cold obstruction and to rot. This sensible warm motion to become a kneaded clod. And the delighted spirit to bathe in fiery floods, or to reside in thrilling region of thick-ribbed ice, to be imprisoned in the viewless winds and blown with restless violence round about the pendant world, or to be worse than worst of those that lawless and uncertain thought imagine, howling. It's just too horrible.
So how does Isabella react to these fears and, yes, his request for her to let him live and what that entails?
Well, her attack is unprecedented. She responds, "Oh, you beast! Oh, faithless coward! Oh, dishonest wretch! Wilt thou be made a man out of my vice? Is it not a kind of incest to take life from thine own sister's shame?" Her tricolon of exclamations labels her terrified brother as animal-like, unmanly, despicable, while she even suggests that he is committing a form of incest by suggesting she, his sister, should go ahead with this sexual act to save him. Whilst Isabella's anger to some extent is understandable, she sees her chastity as her route to heaven. What is noticeable in this speech, and other subsequent ones in this scene, is the complete absence of empathy and compassion, which I would class as key Christian attributes. As well as accusations of indirect incest, Isabella cries that she hopes her mother cheated on their father because she knows her father could not have begat such an unnatural wild creature as him. She also bombards him with imperatives dripping with contempt and desperate desires for his death. "Take my defiance, die, perish," before unfairly suggesting that his lechery is something he does habitually. "Thy sin's not accidental, but a trade," when there is clear evidence in the text to suggest he is devoted to Juliet and that their lovemaking was natural and mutually enjoyable.
So what should we make of this, and how does it influence our perceptions of Isabella? However, I think it's important to recognise the different context of our society today and that of Shakespeare's time before judging Isabella too harshly. In 1604, when Measure for Measure was first performed, a woman's honour, as defined by perceptions of her chastity, was far more important than it is nowadays. Here's Juliet Stephenson, an actress who played Isabella in an RSC production of Measure for Measure in 1983, talking about this issue in the interval of a production of a play at the Globe in 2004.
think the great challenge of playing Isabella now, which I experienced, and every actress will, is that we do live at a time where, you know, human life is at an absolute premium, the highest premium imaginable, and virginity is at a very low premium. There's no price on, we don't take it seriously.
So there is a great difference in the moral values.
There's a huge issue here, because her decision, which is absolutely authentic for her, which is that she is perjuring her soul for eternity by offering up chastity. I mean, you know, it has to be seen as something of the utmost seriousness. You have to try and understand. But there's another issue, even if you can't connect to that, which is that if she colludes with this request from Angelo, if she goes from the highest authority in the land, and it's not a democracy, you can't get rid of him. So if she colludes with this act of immense hypocrisy, she's entering a kind of moral chaos, which is just too chaotic to be imaginable. If you know, in order to save the life of somebody she loves, she then performs the act for which he is being condemned, she is entering into a kind of moral maze, a chaos, which is not livable.
And this is a world with hell.
So, if we keep in the forefront of our mind the idea that female virginity was seen as something extraordinarily precious, perhaps the equivalent to a £1 million property and a monthly income of £50,000, say, and please excuse the feebleness of this equivalent attempt, Isabella's accusations of indirect incest and wild comments about their parents cheating on each other suddenly make more sense. If she were to take this route to save Claudio's life, she would be, to quote Juliet Stephenson, perjuring her soul for eternity.
But notwithstanding this context, Isabella's wolfish pleas for her brother to die and die quickly, not just here but also earlier at the end of Act 2 Scene 4, when she suggests that if Claudio had 20 heads to tender down on 20 bloody blocks, he'd yield them up before his sister should her body stoop to such abhorred pollution, is unsettling and disconcerting. It implies a grimly monomaniacal mind which automatically blocks off human compassion and empathy when faced with difficult challenges, and also suggests a lack of emotional intelligence. It would have been possible, for example, to gently insist to her brother that she had no intention of sleeping with Angelo, and thus prepare him in more Christian fashion for his death.
But it is not just the Jacobean context of attitudes towards female virginity which needs to be considered here, but also the position of women in general. During this period, women belonged to their fathers, or their brothers if their fathers died, and then to their husbands. They were also not permitted to own property. The powerlessness of women seems particularly acute in Measure for Measure, in which women come across as pawns to be manipulated, operated upon by powerful men, most notably the wretched duke come disguised friar. A comparison with All's Well That Ends Well is telling. Both these problem plays include identity sex swap plots. In All's Well, the weedy Bertram thinks he is bedding enchanting virgin Diana, when actually it is his despised wife Helena whom he was forced to marry. And in Measure for Measure, Malvolio-esque hypocrite Angelo thinks he is making almost certainly short-lasting love to nun wannabe Isabella, when actually it is his former betrothed Mariana. Both these tricks seem morally justifiable to me, as they provide a measure of power to legally powerless Helena and Mariana, and force the men they love to act with decency towards them.
In Shakespeare's Sex and Love, Stanley Wells rather ludicrously claims that, in a sense, the bed tricks is the rape of the man by the woman as much as it would be if the woman had drugged the man into insensibility and then forced herself upon him. Yes, rape is defined by the Cambridge Dictionary to force someone to have sex when they are unwilling, but it suggests that either violence or threatening behaviour is typically used. Neither is the case in Measure for Measure or All's Well, and my instinct is that if the man is stupid enough not to cotton on to the fact that he is sleeping with the wrong woman, or simply follows Shakespearean conventions when it comes to improbably not seen through disguises, then he deserves the consequences. I also feel that rape has such emotive connotations that it is inappropriate to tag it to a scheme which simply ends up forcing powerful men to live up to their moral responsibilities. Helena, in All's Well, is well within her rights to expect her marriage with Bertram to be consummated, irrespective of the king's involvement in forcing the latter to marry the former. Mariana, in Measure for Measure, remains foolishly devoted to her former fiancé Angelo, in spite of him callously dumping her 5 years previously following the sudden death of her brother at sea and the loss of her dowry.
However, a crucial difference between the two bed swap plots is that in All's Well, it is the women who devise the plan to collectively improve their lots. Whereas in the depressing, sordid landscape of A Measure for Measure, it is the disguised Duke who, judging by the ending, may be setting up the whole project to a significant extent to reinforce his own authority and help him gain a sexy nun as a wife.
Let's look at the details. In All's Well, Helena independently leaves France for Florence in Italy. Finding out that her husband is there trying to seduce the daughter of a struggling widow, Diana, she successfully persuades the widow, partly through money, that it would not be improper to agree to her daring proposal. Act 3, Scene 7 of the play ends with Helena summing up the scheme to the widow with its slightly dubious morality. Why then tonight let us essay our plot, which if its speed is wicked meaning in a lawful deed, and lawful meaning in unlawful act, where both not sin and yet a sinful fact. But let's about it. Just as Isabella, in Act 2, Scene 2 of Measure for Measure, struggles with the conflict of pleading for Claudio's life when she abhors lechery, so here Helena has no qualms about highlighting the wickedness of seeming to facilitate sex outside marriage to secure a greater good. But the crucial point is that Helena is gaining a degree of control through her actions, which is never the case for Isabella, who remains a chess pawn to be shuffled about by the chessmaster Duke before eventually being gobbled up in the play's ending. In Act 3, Scene 1, the disguised Duke outlines his plan to Isabella, telling her, "Go you to Angelo, answer his requiring with a plausible obedience. Agree with his demands to have sex with you, to the point. Only refer yourself to this advantage. First, that your stay with him may not be long, that the place may have all shadow and silence in it, and the time answer to convenience. We shall advise this wronged maid to steed up your appointments, go in your place." The quantity of imperatives, go, answer, agree, refer, emphasises the disguised Duke's control over both Isabella and the proposed plot, whilst the level of detail is also noticeable. He gives the exact conditions Isabella must specify when agreeing to Angelo's lewd demands. It has to be a quickie, the room must be dark, and that she must be able to specify the time. Whereas in All's Well, Helena specifies to the widow that Diana must demand a ring from Bertram as a condition of her lovemaking. In Measure for Measure, Isabella is simply a passive acquiescer. Her response to the Duke's long speech about the plot is only, "The image of it gives me content already, and I trust it will grow to a most prosperous perfection," with the evidence pointing to Isabella having virtually no say over what she does within the world of Measure, no independent opportunities for decision-making or travel. Is it any wonder that she is so fiercely protective about her chastity, and furious when Claudio tries to appropriate it? For in the play, it is the only area in which a woman can assert anything approaching independence of will. Isabella doesn't even get to return to the nunnery she chose to join in Act 1. And this repressive world for women within the landscape of Measure for Measure, so much more repressive than other comparable Shakespeare plays. There is not a free-spirited Rosaline, as in As You Like It, or a potentially liberating disguise for a woman as a man, as in Twelfth Night, or a feisty, argumentative Beatrice, as in Much Ado About Nothing. It's such a shame, as Isabella frequently shows herself to be an intelligent, persuasive figure. In Act 5, she appears, as instructed by the disguised Duke, to plead for justice from the returned Duke, and builds up brilliantly to a smouldering climax to denounce Angelo. Rather than accuse him immediately, she first calls for generic justice, then emphasises the importance of her voice being heard, before picking up on Angelo's use of the word strange. Most strange, but yet most truly will I speak, that Angelos forsworn. Is it not strange that Angelo is a murderer? Is it not strange that Angelo is an adulterous thief, a hypocrite, a virgin violator? Is it not strange and strange? In the extract on screen, Isabella shows herself sufficiently quick-witted to manipulate Angelo's use of the word strange so that it refers to him rather than her. She uses anaphora when she repeats that Angelo in succession, which allows her to rhetorically pile up damning accusations, which culminates in the extraordinarily emotive tricolon of adulterous thief, a hypocrite, a virgin violator. This is a side we haven't really seen to Isabella. Here, she's ballsy, prepared to use an audience for dramatic effect, and not afraid to take on authority, unlike in Act 2, Scene 1, say, when she needs prompting by Lucio not to give up on her quest to save Claudio's life by lobbying Angelo.
However, as this is the world of measure for measure, this display of female eloquence, albeit following male instructions, is short-lived, as the Duke, still playing his pathetic games, packs Isabella off to prison for either mad rantings or being involved with others, which would include his own disguised persona in a plot against Angelo. Her pleas for Angelo's life aside, following Mariana's entreaties, Isabella is largely silent for the rest of the play. Silent even when she finds out that Claudio is alive, and silent following 2 proposals of marriage from the Duke.
The first proposal links the marriage proposal seamlessly to the return and pardoning of her brother. Unveiling Claudio, he declares that for his sake he is pardoned, before using the same syntax to suggest that for her sake she should have the privilege of becoming his wife. Thus the Duke links his proposed marriage linguistically to the return of Claudio. The implication can be that if Isabella is grateful for the latter, then it would be ungrateful for her to reject the former. The second marriage proposal contains a hilariously inaccurate implication of future equality between the Duke and his new wife. The use of chiasmus in what's mine is yours and what is yours is mine sounds suitably neat and gracious and what a new husband should be saying, but the reality is that this is the final outrageous act from a weak ruler who has had to disguise himself and manipulate multiple characters in order to achieve his goals and reconsolidate his power.
How Isabella reacts to this proposal is entirely dependent on the production. Let's first return to the 1979 BBC version.
Here, Isabel, I have a motion much imports your good, whereto if you'll a willing ear incline. What's mine is yours, and what is yours is mine. So bring us to our chamber where we'll show what's yet behind that's meet you all should know.
There is a gloriously long pause in this production as the audience, both on screen and off, wait to see whether a pensive-looking Isabella decides to take the Duke's hand with a tiny smile, implying clear consent to the marriage. After a good 5 seconds, she does take it, resulting in cheers from the onlookers and a generally happy-looking procession. In a 2004 Globe production, Isabella initially cowers behind a pillar as she is addressed.
Dear Isabella, I have a motion, much imports your good, whereto, if you'll a willing ear incline, what's mine is yours, and what is yours is mine. So, bring us to our palace, where we'll show what's yet behind that's meet you all should know.
In this production, Isabella does not approach the kneeling Duke following his proposal, resulting in the latter attempting to save face by nervously changing the subject to invite everyone to the palace. The play ends with a full dance, and the TV viewer, although perhaps not the majority of those within the Globe Theatre, can't help but notice Isabella's look of repugnance as she feels obliged to join in the formal dance with the Duke, which involves close proximity with the man she knows she will have to marry. So, how to sum up the character of Isabella within the strange, difficult to pin down play of Measure for Measure? Well, in much of the play, she shows herself to be a good, caring Christian, pleading for both Claudio and later Angelo's life, in spite of obvious reasons why she might prefer not to. However, there are occasional signs of repressed sexuality, most noticeably when, ironically, explaining to Angelo why she would rather die than agree to his proposal for sex in exchange for brother's life. She puts extraordinary for a modern audience value on her chastity, and no wonder perhaps, given Jacobean views about its importance for those Christians keen to attain eternal life beyond our mortal coil. There are glimpses of intelligent independence of thought, which are snuffed following the Duke's deeply cynical, opportunistic and perverted forced marriage proposal. After all, who wouldn't want to find a way to bed a nun? This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production, exploring the character of Isabella in Measure for Measure. Many thanks for watching.